back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
And welcome back to The Law Show. We're talking about personal injury with our experts today, Scott Stanley and Kevin Gourlay from Murphy Battista in downtown Vancouver in the Scotia Tower right there on Georgia, right? So it's good to have you guys here today. And we were talking about concussions and brain injuries. Now, this is front page news. So run through some of the changes you think have happened. What particular athletes or incidents that have occurred that have brought this to the forefront? So obviously football is the big one, right?
Well, I'm going to go south of the border and say football because I'll let Kevin talk about Sydney, but football is king in terms of the research. That's where people are looking at the epidemiology of concussions, the occurrence rates, and unfortunately the research is directed at football players because you can put these little calipers in their helmets and determine how much force they're getting and what the what their physiology is after they've sustained these forces. But the problem with football players is they are almost naturally selected to be able to withstand forces, I say. And, there's an incentive for these people not to report or underreport injuries because, especially with NFL football players, they're on contracts that are not guaranteed. So if they're not on the roster, they're not going to get paid. So I think it's skewing the data.
Well, maybe that's what will change is that the NFL will say, you're like a hockey player. If you're under contract whether you're injured or not. And then they would report more often.
Well, that's why they hold out because they know they're not going to, if they're not on the roster, they're not going to get money. So, but it's a violent sport and it's a ruthless business.
Well, I watched the film Concussion, which was the backstory to all of this and how the NFL dragged their feet on the fact that there really was a problem. And the only way to really know if they've had this, long-term brain injury is when they pass away is to do the autopsy and to do the biopsy of the brain and to find out that this has actually happened. And the NFL fought it. And I highly recommend the movie. If you watch the film, it shows the whole story about how the NFL fought it. But now you're saying the NFL is on board and another leaders in the research. So they've come 180 degrees.
Well, I think they're I wouldn't call them leaders by any stretch of the imagination.
But they're helping to fund some of the research.
I think they have to. But really it's the high school football, college football, professional football where they're actually, you can't really study a collision. It's almost impossible to study collision because you don't want to put people in car accidents and smash them up. And I'm not sure. It's a good starting point for the data. We'll see where it goes. But I think it's skewed.
I think more is being done here, though. I could be wrong about this, but my understanding is that some of the hockey programs, maybe at UBC, are using those same monitors inside helmets to measure the impact forces that hockey players are having up here. What we're seeing a lot more now in all sorts of sports, contact sports at least, are kids undergoing neuropsychological testing, even brief neuropsychological testing at the start of a season. And then if they have a concussion or if there's concern that they might have a concussion, they have a baseline testing to go back to and see how they're performing after the incident to try to be in a better position to diagnose if they are still suffering the effects of that.
That's a great way to do it. Every player does the test at the beginning of the season, and then they can evaluate them. That's a great way to do it.
And we had a trial last year. Our client had been 16 years old when he was hit by a car that went off, drifted off the side of the road and hit him as he was walking down the street in Kelowna. He had been a very good competitive mountain biker, the type that does the flips and the spins in the air and that sort of thing. And because of that, he had a couple of concussions beforehand. And his mother had taken him to get some neuropsychological testing done because of those accidents in mountain biking.
So you had some evaluation to base it on, right?
Yeah, so it was one of the rare car accident cases where we have pre-accident baseline testing to compare it to, which from our perspective is very valuable. And from his, it is, of course, too, from a treatment perspective.
That's interesting. So Sidney Crosby is raised the Stanley Cup recently. He's won 2 Stanley Cups, 2 gold medals. He's our guy, even though he doesn't play for a Canadian team. But the whole story of Sidney Crosby You're finding out now maybe he didn't have concussion, or he maybe had some, but wasn't all concussion related.
Well, I think when Sidney Crosby was on the sidelines for so long, I think half the country was, come on, Sidney, man up and get back on the ice. And there was half the people said, what is this all about? I mean, if anyone is going to get back on the ice as quick as they can, it's Sidney Crosby. He's our golden boy, literally. Mm-hmm. And I think that really put us on the map as Canadians in terms of what really is a concussion. But as I understand it now, Sidney's lingering problems were probably less likely related to a concussion, but more related to an underlying neck injury.
So he would have sustained a concussion but recovered because he was off the ice, but the other issues could be from a neck injury.
Yeah, probably.
And I think also it's important to bear in mind that none of these things are taken in isolation. Mm-hmm. It's rare that you have a concussion without other injuries. It's rare that somebody is pain-free after the type of hits that Sidney Crosby's
He's
sustained.
in a highly violent game, right?
Yeah, and I think there's no doubt he's had concussions in the past. I think that the hit that actually took him out when he was out for a long time was the kind of hit that he would sustain a couple hundred times a season. It wasn't a big, violent collision, and it presumably must have been the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Mm-hmm. that it was that reason, that hit, that took him out, because it wasn't a particularly significant force.
That's the most beguiling thing. I mean, I have talked to some of the leading brain scientists in the world, and they can't really say with certainty or they just really can't say at all who is more likely to have a concussion and what the outcome is going to be. I've seen people with very, very serious brain injuries, which are more than a concussion, go on to make a near full functional recovery, and people with what would be considered neurologically as being a minor concussion never return to work. And the experts, world experts, really can't explain why that is.
So you must have, in personal injury, somebody's had a car expert, you pull in these experts, right? You
Absolutely.
have people that are on your team to put forward your case. So what caliber of people do you talk to?
Well, we try to get the best we can. I mean, the case that Kevin's talking about, you brought in the Canadian expert all the way from Ontario.
Well, usually you'll have a neurologist, you'll have a neuropsychologist, you'll have a physiatrist, which is an expert in what they call physical medicine and rehabilitation. You'll usually have a psychiatrist. You'll usually have the family doctor, occupational therapist. So there is a wide range of experts on the significant brain injury cases.
So what do these physicians tell you about brain injury? You just alluded to it. There's a wide spectrum, and someone who looks like they don't have much trauma can be off work for a long period of time.
I mean, at the end of the day, Zach, they really look at what was the person like before, because with a concussion, there is usually no physical evidence to corroborate it. If you have a more serious brain injury, you can do a brain scan, an MRI, and a CT scan, and they'll show some damage. Most of the concussion cases that we deal with, there is no evidence of injury there. That's because the injury is so microscopic it can't be seen. So it really boils down to what was the person like before and what were they like afterwards? And is that reasonably associated with the diagnosis of a concussion? It really comes down to their credibility. And so it's fertile ground for insurance companies like ICBC and other insurance companies to attack the credibility of the person that sustained a concussion. Their life really goes on trial.
So how debilitating can a one-time concussion in a car accident be to somebody?
It can be debilitating, but I think what people should take from this is that most of the time it's not. And part of the concern, part of the reason doctors don't want to diagnose concussion is for people to be concerned that they're from too early a stage that they're not going to get better. And most people will get better. I think if people are out there listening are suffering from the kinds of symptoms we're talking about, they should take heart to some extent that Sidney Crosby was raising the cup the other week. People do get better most of the time. Mm-hmm. As Scott was referring to before, our perspective might be somewhat skewed because we deal with the 10% or the 1% or the 0.1% who for some reason are that unfortunate few who 5 years out are still suffering from one or two concussive events.
I mean, Kevin and I did one of the biggest concussion cases in Canadian history, and it was a really hardworking, credible, healthy emergency room physician who was hit from behind in a very minor car accident, and which would, 99 times wouldn't even produce a concussion. He had the unfortunate of having sustained a concussion and then further fell into that 10% that never got better, and it took away his career. thankfully he didn't take away his family. But we've seen some really bad things happen to people that have had a one-time concussion. This fellow didn't have a history of concussion. He was healthy. No reason to expect he wouldn't make a full recovery, but he just didn't.
And he's a doctor. He's aware of how the body works.
Yeah, there's just it's an absolute mystery. They're starting to do some research about sort of genetics and to see what role they play. And what we're seeing now is with really severe brain injuries and moderate brain injuries, there seems to be a correlation with bad outcomes in a certain type of gene, the gene that's also found in, it's a marker for dementia and Alzheimer's.
Sure. Well, that would make sense because that's affecting the brain. Yeah.
But they haven't made that same association with minor brain injuries and concussions.
So was this physician able to go back to work? Or did he ever recover? Or did you settle because he was going to need long-term care?
He was unable to return to work. Tried like hell to get back, but he just couldn't do it.
And so that one went to trial rather than settled because they fought what was causing him to not be able to go back to work.
Yeah. And so how do you, this is a law show. How do you prove that?
Well, the insurer in that case was ICBC and probably 3 other insurance companies, and they basically just said this isn't true. And it's quite obvious that it was true because he's a very credible guy. And in fact, he would go back to work and not tell his doctor about it. His doctor would say, you ought not to be going back to work, but he would say, I'm going to go back to work anyways. So he was clearly the type of behavior, someone that's not faking or not a liar. And what we did is we basically went and created an inventory of everybody he'd ever known. And thankfully, many of them were doctors themselves and caregivers and police officers and really people that are very good at describing this fellow before and what he was like afterwards. And that's basically how we proved the case.
And so what did all of this evidence come together to say from police officers and other physicians that he was markedly different?
Well, these were good friends, and they were sort of initially, they were hesitant to say anything bad about this man whom they loved. And this was one of the greatest human beings I've ever met. And the last thing his friends wanted to say, geez, he's just really not the same guy. He's not as sharp. He's not as pleasant. He's a little bit irritable. But eventually, when we were able to tease that out of them, we were able to show that this man was markedly different right from the day after, right from the moment he had this insult to the current time.
So the effects there on him were significant, but it's also part and parcel a product of him being a high-functioning individual before with a very demanding job where you
can't make mistakes.
You simply can't do that job when you're not functioning as an emergency room physician. If he was working on, a packaging line, maybe he could have continued to do it to some extent, but certainly not as an ER doctor.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. We don't want guys that are not 100%. You're visiting them in ER.
I actually have a theory that if you have a brain injury, or if you have a concussion, it would be much easier for you to return to work as a lawyer than it would be to return to work at McDonald's.
You guys bring your own lawyer jokes. This is great. I don't even bring a lawyer joke. We are talking about a personal injury on the Law Show. Scott Stanley and Kevin Gourlay, my guests from Murphy Battista. And we'll continue next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.